Hey there, I'm Chris Marion, and you're listening to the Queen Bee Sessions, conversations with Wisconsin women in conservation. Don't try and say that 10 times in a row. It's March 17th, 2022, and this is session 1. We're celebrating Women's History Month by launching this podcast with a true Wisconsin conservation rock star, August Ball. She probably really needs no introduction, but just for some context, August is the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation and Consulting in Milwaukee. Her business is the first Black-owned certified B Corp in Wisconsin. She's won loads of awards for her efforts in both conservation and diversity, equity, and inclusion, but she's also just really cool. You should Google her. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us, August.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Well, lots of us get involved in conservation work through hunting with a favorite adult or being a kid obsessed with reptiles. But you have a different story, and I'd love to hear how you got involved with this work of taking care of the earth.
Yeah. So, I often say that I am an accidental entrepreneur and an accidental conservationist. So my family moved to the Philippines from Wisconsin when I was 4 years old. And my stepfamily in the Philippines owned a farm, still owned a farm. And if you know anyone who grew up working on a farm, most of us, when we become adults, want nothing to do with farm work, right? Because it's hard work. And one of the things I thought was so interesting when I came back to the States when I was 19 was actually realizing that a lot of the tactics and farming techniques that my family was using, we never called them like sustainability or conservation, right? It was just how we did it, right? And so I always I was very passionate about policy, global policy. And I always thought I was actually going to get into foreign policy and work as a consulate until I realized that, and some consulates, if we have any consulates who are listening, I might get in trouble. But to me, it seemed like that job was going to be reduced down to stamping passports and like helping, stranded Americans get home. The bigger reason why I decided to go into a different direction in undergrad was I realized that I have a very strong opinion, and I don't usually take lightly to having to keep that opinion to myself. And I realized if I work for the federal government, that would not be an option for me. So instead, I went into sociology. And through sociology, I became a community educator. I became really obsessed with data. I became very obsessed with why people do what they do, how land has been distributed over time. And so, I would say probably the first event that happened to me that made me very curious and maybe even passionate about environmentalism, about conservation, was when I worked at a neighborhood community center on the north side of Milwaukee, right next door to a state forest named Havenwoods. And I loved the work I was doing with the young people in the after-school program, but I realized that none of them had been across the street to this forest. They literally lived a block away. And I started, doing some research on the impacts of a lack of connection for young people to nature, looking at the history of conservation in the US and what the impacts have been on Indigenous communities. In a lot of Indigenous communities, like the word conservation is a dirty word, actually. It brings with it, right? Like a lot of stuff.
Sure.
So that kind of began this very non-linear trajectory for me into conservation. It started with wanting to foster the same love of nature that I had growing up in other young people, but also it was also directly connected to recognizing that when young people don't have access to safe green spaces, there's certain chemicals in the brain that don't get released. And unfortunately, sometimes the end result of that is that young people attempt to get those natural chemicals released through risky behavior. So for me, as much as I love nature and I love hiking and I love kayaking and being outdoors, for me, it's actually about people. And it's
Yeah.
about the stories connected to the land, right? Because as you know, as much as I value, the other animals in our kingdom, and land, to me, it's about protecting it for generations to come. So if we're not engaging people in this work, I personally don't see that much benefit to it. Usually, right? Typical human response, like, what's in it for us human? But that's truly that's my truth. I truly believe to me, conservation is about protecting green space for generations to come equitably.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pause there because I can go on a whole tangent.
Well, that's an amazing story. I actually didn't think that's where that was going to go, but you can tell I'm taking down notes, which is always the case when I'm with you. August, full disclosure, I've been through some of August's diversity, equity, and inclusion work in a recent cohort, and she is extraordinarily quotable. So we are blessed to get some really nice nuggets today. And the nugget I was writing down was this piece about young people not having access to green spaces. So many women conservationists have an origin story to their work that has to do with loving fish or being really connected to frogs. I have a frog story, but your story is a connection to really people and a passion for access. That's really different and really cool. So thank you for another great quote.
Yeah. No, and so for me, because working, on a farm, for example, like my job was feeding the chickens, which is a very smelly job.
Oh,
you
yeah.
ever, right? Had to clean out chicken coops. So I was like, oh, I'm going to move to the city and I'm going to have this fancy life, right? But we can't run from our core.
Yeah.
It brings us back in. And I'm so glad it did. But yeah, for me, it was definitely about young people specifically, because, again, it's about those future generations. So yeah.
Well, it's great. That's a great origin story. What is the origin story of Cream City Conservation and Consulting? And throw something in about that cool logo.
Oh yes. Well, I'll start off by saying the logo, which is our two Pulaskis that are crossed together. That was actually my favorite trail tool. So as I mentioned, I got into conservation by pure accident. I was working as a community educator in a after school program. And I had kind of reached a point where there in a lot of nonprofits, there's nowhere else for some of us to go once you've reached a certain point in your career other than to go to a different organization, right? Because a lot of times organizations are small. There's only one person in each role.
Right.
So you either wait out the person to retire, right? Or you go somewhere else. And so there was a posting for a conservation program manager role for the state of Wisconsin for a national nonprofit. And I had no background in environmental sciences. At this point in my career, I couldn't even tell you what buckthorn or honeysuckle was. I had never built a trail before. And the plant species that I was familiar with were plant species that were in Southeast Asia, right? So as I was, teaching some of our young people about plant ID and biodiversity, which, by the way, a majority of it, before I joined this Conservation Corp program, I learned from Will Allen, who started Growing Power. So a little side story that I will never forget that made me realize that, like, oh, I want to do that. And if any of you know Will Allen or know of him, what is he, like 7 feet tall, this big black guy, and who's a farmer, right? He was a former, I think, NBA player.
Yeah.
Something like, I know nothing about sports. But I just watched, we brought some of our students from this after school program to Growing Power. And one of my young ones, I think he was maybe 7 or 8. He had a soft place in my heart because I also have ADD, and this child definitely had ADHD. I was bouncing off the walls. And the moment that Mr. Will Allen took him over to the this bin where they had there was compost and they had like some worms, and just like took his hands and put it in the soil. And instantly this child who could not sit still, bouncing off the walls, you just saw his shoulders drop, his eyes kind of open up, and he's looking at these worms and this dirt in his hand. He's like, "That's cool." And what just happened? Right? So, Will Allen is a very, he's the type of speaker that just really pulls you in. But something happened that day where I was like, I want to recreate that experience for so many young people. And so then it started with, leading hikes and telling young people that, hey, like, this land is yours. And we were walking through, Havenwood State Forest. And I'm telling them, your family owns this. This is ours as a community. You can come walk here anytime you want. You can come and check out the birds. You can see deer here. And of course, some of my students who had never been here, they're like, are there bears in there, Miss August? And I'm like, probably not. Right? But we don't know what we don't know. So valid question, right? One of my favorite questions that one of our teens, and once I started working for the Conservation Corps, asked me when we were building a trail somewhere out in the savannah in Oak Creek in Wisconsin was, why are we building this? Who's going to come out here? Like, what are we going to do with this trail? Why don't we just put cement down here? And of course, I chuckled a little bit initially, but then I thought, that's a very valid question for a young person to ask who doesn't go hiking, who doesn't spend time in the outdoors, right? Of course, they're going to ask that question. So rather than me make the child feel small and, silly for asking this question, like we just started having a conversation about it. So in terms of the origin story of C4, I worked for this National Conservation Corps program called Student Conservation Association for almost 10 years. And I thought I was going to retire with this organization. When they first hired me, the first thing I thought was, you all know I don't have a background in conservation. I was like, I just want to make sure you didn't have me confused with someone else. Because when I first heard about the job opportunity, I actually shared it with a colleague or a friend of mine who is based in Chicago, who is a naturalist and has, that background. And she didn't want to travel for work or what's what I'm looking for?
Move.
She didn't want to move. Yeah, for work. So I thought, well, gosh, like this seems like such a cool job opportunity. You get to lead young people, in their first work experience, but also their first work experience outdoors. I would get to build my own team. And I thought, why not? Right. And as you know, Chris, and we talked about in our workshops, men do this all the time, right? Yep. Men see a job posting that they know they maybe are 50% qualified for. They're like, I'll figure it out when I get there. And
That's
maybe
right.
It's my own ego. I was like, and I'm 5 feet tall. So my dad has always said I have a little bit of a Napoleon complex where I'm like, I can do it. Right. So I figured the worst they can say is no. Right. So I applied, got the position. And once I got it, I asked my supervisor at the time, why did you hire me? And she said, August, we can teach you this trail stuff. We can teach you plant ID. We need someone who actually likes people, especially teenagers. And over the past years, we found a lot of people with great environmental, science background, not so crazy about the teen part, not so crazy about the people part, right? And I was like, oh, okay. And that is the same logic I used to push for some changes in terms of who we were hiring as crew leaders. Yeah. So how the structure went, right, was every summer we would hire 20 to 25 adult crew leaders to lead up to 100 teens, divvied up into crews of 10 or 12 all across Milwaukee County to do trail installation and maintenance, invasive species removal, tree planting, green infrastructure maintenance, things of that nature. And my first year on the job, I realized that the teens we were hiring were predominantly from the north side of Milwaukee, so predominantly African-American students, Black students, a few Hmong, a few Latino students, but for the most part, it was mostly African-American youth. And then my staff were mostly white. Mm-hmm. Most of them came from rural backgrounds or suburban backgrounds. Hearts of gold. These were amazing people. They were great. The downside, though, is that they didn't have the cultural humility and exposure that was needed in order to resonate with what some of our young people like were living, what their lived experience was. And so when conversations around difference would come up, they would do what they had been, what most, white, rural and suburban people are taught to do when conversations about difference come up, which is shut it down, avoid it, right? And so they never got to build that muscle. And I noticed that it wasn't just happening in the Milwaukee chapter, it was happening all across the nation. Like the SCA has programs from the Bay Area to New York. So a colleague of mine from the Bay Area, actually, we got together and started creating training programs to help build the racial literacy of our crew leaders, to help them navigating conversations around difference, to foster a sense of belonging across identities. And that became so successful that we started being asked to do that at multiple trainings, not just for our own, state trainings. Anyway, so one of the things I wanted to change then was also who was deemed qualified to crew lead. So some of the requirements were that you had to have a certain number of seasons of trail building under your belt. So I got together with other program managers who were kind of running into that same thing of finding folks that they knew were going to be amazing crew leaders in terms of the youth development side, but maybe didn't have the conservation background skills. And so we started changing that. We started, asking those empowered to change the requirements to say either or. You can either have these seasons of trail experience or X number of years experience working with young people, specifically young people in inner cities and young people of color. And so that essentially changed the trajectory of how we hired. Some of it also included no longer allowing our HR department to pre-vet the folks that we were allowed to interview. So we would just get our folks directly without them. Yeah. So all of these changes essentially shifted who came into our candidate pool, like literally within one season.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
I have one former staff in particular who is now actually in Florida, still doing conservation work. And she had shared with me, she's a Black woman, she had shared with me, she had applied for a crew leader role 3 times and was never, and she had a environmental science degree, never got in. Somehow was not deemed qualified. And she worked for me for quite a few years. She also worked with the DNR. So it's interesting, right? Like how that works.
Your work kind of coming up now at a time where so much hiring has gone to computer first, then interview is so timely. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I love this concept of cultural humility that I have not heard that term before. And I think you're talking about a curiosity on the part of the hiring team, and a curiosity then on the part of the leaders. And I think curiosity is kind of like the foundation of conservation, but also of just like the beloved community that we look for, right? I mean, we're not going to have a beloved community if we have our minds made up about each other, but also a lot of folks have their minds made up about the natural world. And that's so polarized now too. I mean, your work is so timely, August. It's so it's just what we need now. And I mean, C4 is a really interesting, I started Googling you last year and there's a lot of great content about you and photos of you with very diverse teams, diverse in ages. And you are very small.
I don't realize how small I am until I see photos of myself, next to, averagely sized people. I'm like, because I feel 7 feet tall.
Well, but you are 7 feet tall in influence and also in just you're busting down a lot of walls. But I think even that's a cool part of your story, because it's like, look, natural resources. I mean, Wisconsin Women in Conservation, we're trying to welcome women into a space that's full of very large guys. And it's like going to the Guitar Center. If you want to buy, an electric guitar as a woman, it's like, oh my gosh, I need a doula to come in here with me because it's quite uncomfortable. And I'm
Oh,
definitely not going to sit
exactly.
in the middle playing riffs. But
Right.
wow.
Totally.
Well,
Yeah, totally.
so you decided to organize C4 as a B corporation. Has it always been a B Corp? And what is that? Is that has that always
Yeah.
been part of your DNA?
So so B Corp was always the model I had aspired to. So to back up a little bit, so when I was working for the Student Conservation Association, unexpectedly, they had called myself and our Detroit program manager into the Chicago regional office for what I thought was going to be a conversation about a race. And it turned out to be a conversation about shutting down our two cities,
Oh my
like our two
gosh.
programs. Yeah. And so the origin story for C4 was literally by accident. It was intended to keep some of the young people who were former crew members engaged in a service project on Saturdays. Like it was meant to be a 6-week thing with a former partner who basically said, "Hey, we got this grant. The organization you worked for isn't functioning anymore in this city. We think you still have connections to the young people, right?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, of course." And they're like, "Well, can you just like call them up?" And so it was totally not very well thought out. And but this is why I say we do nothing alone.
Mm.
We literally turned that 6-week weekend project into, oh gosh, it was a 2.5-year project because we were able to leverage partnerships with Employ Milwaukee and the Neighborhood House Nature Center and River Revitalization Foundation. I mean, we were able to essentially partner together to leverage funding. And how I started kind of consulting was that organizations who knew me from my SCA days and saw how I had shifted the demographics of our crew leaders over time and gotten young people of color to come back year after year to do what is very hard physical labor because they loved it and they loved being outdoors and they were looking forward to the experience and being with their friends and having these life-changing experiences that they, with other teens from their same neighborhoods. They wanted to know how I could implement that or how they could implement that in their own organizations. And so what started off as just meeting friends for coffee turned into, look, this is inefficient. I'm going to do a workshop at a park, 2 hours, come on out, and if you find value, bring some cash and donate whatever you want. Whatever you donate is going to go to pay these teens to finish up this trail, And that's literally how it started, Chris. And I was already working at the county parks department at this time. And so essentially all of the funds that I was making from doing consulting work and workshops, I just used to pay the teens. And then I realized, oh my goodness, like teens with sharp tools we need insurance. I should probably form less before I get sued and lose my house. Right. So then it was very much so like when people are like, oh, how'd you start it? Like there was no business plan. All I knew was that I didn't want to be another nonprofit because what I've learned with nonprofit is that sometimes philanthropy is part of the problem when it comes to social inequities.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been introduced to this concept of social entrepreneurship through a program I was in, and then discovered this concept of B Corp. And B Corp is essentially businesses that are certified as being good for people, the planet, and are profitable. It means that they have gone through a rigorous assessment of their policies for their staff, their sourcing for their materials, their products that they are serving, right? And so there's a multitude of there's a B assessment that you can go on and kind of go through yourself if you have a business or an organization. I always knew that like that was the model I wanted to use. I wanted to be a part of this movement that showed that business, because I came from a background of very anti-business, to be really transparent. I was one of those, neo hippies in undergrad that was like, capitalism is the worst. And and there are problems with capitalism. Absolutely. We won't get into that on this call, but but what I really was inspired by is seeing these various examples of businesses that were using their business to solve a social problem,
Yeah.
to solve an inequity, right? And that we could do business in a way that created value rather than extracted things. And I'm not the only business that does that, right? And so to find a whole community of other B Corps who did this, and it took us 5 years to get certified. So it's a long
Wow.
process. Yeah. I mean, we started working on it with another consulting firm through a program through B Labs called Level, which it helps BIPOC organizations and women-led organizations get certification. And that just, just totally flung us into the B Corp process. But it was those principles that were very important to me, right? That, we had a policy around mental health leave that and a lot of this stuff was in my mind, that because I had hired a former crew member she came up through the ranks, Karina Gonzalez, who started as a crew member and then was an apprentice and then was a crew leader and now is our program coordinator and runs our conservation corps programming. So both of us together, we run a very lean ship here. We had to sit down and say, did we ever write this down? Like, this is how we operate, but is it written anywhere?
Yeah.
Literally had to put paper to paper. And we scored fairly high. I forget exactly what our numbers were. It was over 100 points, which I think the top points might be 140 or something. But anyway, yeah. So I wanted us to be independent of philanthropy, because what I saw from my whole life prior, I worked in nonprofits. I realized that a lot of times you're funded because of the quantity that you do, not necessarily the quality. And it's almost a bit it can be like a popularity contest, right? And if you're the flavor of the month, everybody wants to give you money.
Right.
And then when you're not, right? And then I also wasn't that crazy about the competition thing that tends to happen. And I have this perspective that if we're all trying to create value in the world, I don't want to be in this position where I'm I'm helping more than you're helping.
Right.
That just feels weird.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Your experience of going through that certification seems to have given you a great foundation for your consulting work, because you're challenging nonprofits now to step up their benefit to it's very challenging stuff that you're exposing people to. I think because, the nonprofit world definitely is based in, there's obviously a scarcity mentality, and there is competition. And then there's just the mission shift that can happen from a big grant or a big donor. It's hard to stay true to your original vision when the funding is coming from different places.
Absolutely. And I've seen how problematic it can be when an entity who's holding the purse strings is telling you, hey, Chris, I want you to do this program this way, in this manner. And the entity has never done this work before, right? There's no ability to even share with the funder, here's what's not working, right? So we can actually learn from it. There's so much pressure to be everything's great, everything's fine, nothing went wrong, right? So how do we actually grow from that? And my biggest bugaboo with this stuff, right, around philanthropy is that so often if you follow the money, as you know, I love history. When you follow the money on these big philanthropic institutions, you begin to find out that they're funding you to solve the problems that they actually created, that created their wealth.
Well, certainly, because there's the greenwashing of everything and and we want that money so bad.
One of our two biggest funders when I was working for the Student Conservation Association was Walmart and ExxonMobil.
Yeah, exactly.
And Nestle was our third. Mm-hmm. And I remember this explicitly because we were sitting in this auditorium watching the video, The Story of Water, and or Tapped is what it was called. Sorry. And one of the students got up midway through the movie and said, hey, Nestle's one of our sponsors.
Oh, wow. Well, that is a huge tension that we walk in the nonprofit world, but what a great
no one's hands are clean. That's the other thing too. Even no one's hands are clean.
No one's
Right?
hands are clean.
Yeah.
No. And there's nothing dirty about making money. So that's, it's the way,
Yes.
not inherently dirty about making money.
Exactly. I just want to say something about that, Chris, because that was a huge mindset shift I had to get over in order to build a business that was indeed profitable, right? Because for me initially, my mindset was like, give it all away, just, you know, and while yes, that might seem really altruistic initially, it doesn't actually help move the needle if you can't like pay for your groceries, right? Or if you can't, if you don't have a long-term plan. So what I had to realize, and even charging, right? So for me, I had to come up against this icky, weird feeling of charging for my knowledge.
Right.
Because in a way, it felt like, am I financially benefiting from oppression because I'm teaching about it? Like it took me a while to get from doing it from a pro bono standpoint or from a just give whatever you can. It's going to go to the like almost apologetically being like, I can give you this information, but so then I realized that money is neutral.
Yeah.
Like, this concept of like money being bad. No, like humans do bad things, right? We make bad decisions, but money is always neutral.
Right.
And we can use money to create value, or we can use money to promote destruction and inequity. And what I have found is that nothing, and this is not my original thought. I wish I could remember who I heard this from initially, but it was from another businesswoman. If any of you know who said this first, please do chat into Chris. But there was another female business owner who said, nothing bad happens when women make more money. When women start businesses, nothing bad happens because time and time again, we've seen that women will reinvest that money into their communities, into their family. They create value with it. They don't take it to, to go gamble. They don't, not saying that no women ever get, but you know what I'm saying? Like there's just a different cultural component to how women tend to run business. We look at some countries right now that are ran by women. Yeah. Look at the improvements in quality of life that their constituents are having. Well, it's undeniable.
I think this segues into another topic I wanted to touch on, and that is ambition. I think women with money and ambition, there's a hesitation and a struggle. C4 is obviously Cream City. You're based in Milwaukee. You've told a lot of stories about your teams in Milwaukee, but it seems like your reach is quite beyond that. Based on my experience in one of your cohorts, what is the geographic scope of your work now? And what is your ambition for C4?
Oh, that's a great question. And this is also why, as I often say, I did not have even though I come from a family of, entrepreneurs, nurses, and farmers, I didn't ever really feel like I had an entrepreneurial bone in my body, which I'm realizing I do. But I named it Cream City Conservation, my company, Cream City Conservation, because I honestly didn't think it was going to exist forever. And actually the name came from former crew members where we started this bicycle crew, and they named themselves Cream. We would allow our crews to give themselves a name. So they had like a sense of, belonging and identity together. And they named themselves Cream City Cycle. So when I was doing this kind of, program, ad hoc program on the weekends with students, I was like, oh, we need a name. And one of the students who was on that Cream City Cycle crew said, why don't we call ourselves Cream City Conservation? And I was like, that's a great idea. And so there became the name. Never in a million years did I think that I would do any work outside of Milwaukee. That just literally, when I began, it was intended to be a 6-week thing. It wasn't supposed to be a business. But what ended up happening was the demand for information, the demand for trainings, the demand for assessments, things like that evolved over time became so great. And mind you, I've never done an advertisement. All of my clients have come to me word of mouth, which goes to show the power of community and the power of trust, right? So during the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, I would say most of my clients were from the Wisconsin area and the surrounding Midwest area, because most of my workshops were done in person.
Mm.
Every now and again, I might have a client in California or in DC, but most of the bulk was right in the Midwest. When the pandemic first happened, I immediately panicked because I had just gone through a divorce. I had been diagnosed with cancer, and my aunt in the Philippines, who was literally like a second mother to me, passed away all within 1 year. And I was just like, where is Ashton Kutcher? Like, because I am being punked right now.
Oh my gosh.
So it's like, and I almost like hesitate to joke, like, what's next? Because, oh, don't dare tempt the universe. And so when this happened, I thought, oh my goodness, this is it. Like, I don't know what am I going to do? I'm not going to be able to work. And the answer became moving everything online, which then manifested into clients calling from Florida, Toronto, South Africa.
Wow.
Right. And so now our reach is global just within the past 2 years. When you ask about like, what are my aspirations for C4? And this has not changed. My aspirations for C4 has always been to work ourselves out of a job. Every time I get up in the morning and I sit in this chair or I hop on a call, the question I always ask myself is, what needs to happen for what I do to not be needed? Right? I don't want to be talking about this stuff, about racial inequity, when I'm, 55, 60. I probably will. But the goal, right? I believe if I work every day and I approach this work from how do I empower my clients, the young people I get the privilege to work with, how do I make myself obsolete and empower them to see themselves as the hero in their own story, to see their own ability? Because here's the thing, Chris. A lot of times my clients, like, we'll go through the whole process, as you're aware, of starting off with an assessment, phase 1, so that they have a benchmark of where they are, going through a series of education sessions. So we actually have some shared language to discuss these problems with, right? And then going into creating their roadmap of how they're going to implement these things. What I typically find is that when it's time to actually put boots on the ground, a lot of organizations will come up with every excuse under the sun of why they can't begin implementing. They'll say things like, we need a bigger budget to do this or that. And we have to write a grant and we got to do another assessment. And then, like, no, you don't. You know what your shortcomings are. You know exactly what you're doing that has produced the homogenous demographics of your organization. Get to work, right? People love sitting in the workshops. They love going through the assessment. I would say the roadmap stuff gets a little tricky because it requires some honesty. But then when it comes time to, okay, I'm letting you loose, implement. Oh, now when it's time to actually go to work, some organizations really struggle with that. Well,
no doubt. I mean, that's how we got here, right? Just the long slog of trying to move an iceberg. It's just big and entrenched, but you're working in 2 really uphill sectors. I mean, conservation, saving the planet, and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. These are arguably probably the 2 of the most entrenched sectors. These are difficult spaces where work never ends. You clearly have hope for progress. I mean, you have to.
Oh, absolutely. And optimism, a spirit of optimism is literally one of our company values.
Yeah.
We have to have optimism. Yeah. Because why else would we do this? If I didn't believe this problem could be solved, I mean, I have other interests, right? Like, I could be in a tiny house somewhere in the mountains with my dog and my micro garden. There are many other things I would probably rather be doing with my day than regurgitate historical facts about, how horrible American policy has been for women and people of color and folks of marginalized identities. But I do it because I believe in the capacity of humans. I actually truly believe that one of the main reasons why we are experiencing all of these book bans and muzzling of information is because those in power who are pushing for those tactics understand quite clearly that the everyday person is good. The everyday person, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, is a good person who is empathetic, who is fair-minded. And they know that if each person knew how we got here and understood what has transpired to cause the inequities we are tackling with today, they would not stand for it.
Yeah.
They would fight against it. They would fix it immediately. And that is exactly why this information, teachers are being muzzled, book bans are happening. There's restrictions. There have been restrictions on, these anti-woke bills where you can't, give information to staff that makes them uncomfortable about their identity. It's quite clear that the intention is to maintain a level of ignorance.
Yes.
It's intentional because people, and then it leaves people feeling like when they do go through this education at, 40, 45 years old or older or whatnot, feeling as though there's something wrong with them because how did I not know this? Right. And now you have this cognitive dissonance of like, I have 2 degrees and, and a PhD. How did I not know this? And I'm of the mindset of bringing folks back in and saying, helping them understand that this has nothing to do, and you've heard me say this before, Chris, this has nothing to do with your level of intelligence, your formal education, your character. This has everything to do with what you've had the opportunity to be exposed to.
Right.
And once you've been exposed to the information, now comes the judgment. What are you willing to do about that? Are you going to succumb to the very natural human response, which is to push away information that's uncomfortable? Or are you going to embrace that discomfort and push forward so that we can create a world where, yes, identity doesn't determine who gets to thrive? That is where the judgment needs to come in, not prior.
But it's hard for people to get to that point because it
is
painful. I mean,
hard, but not impossible.
Not impossible.
Yeah.
Not impossible.
Yeah. There's a thin line between giving ourselves grace for what we did not know and holding ourselves accountable to move forward and to take action. It's a thin line, but it is not invisible.
Well, that's another great quote, August. That's so true. And I think that people struggle with the concept of climate change for some of the same reasons that they struggle with the concept that we are not an inclusive society. Because you're not sure what your role was, but getting right down to brass tacks and saying, no, this happened. There's all this history. And now is when you have a choice. You don't have to excuse anything in your past. Let's talk about right now. That's really powerful. Well, we had a little conversation about hot yoga on our email setup. It seems pretty essential in the uphill work that you do, that self-care needs to be a part of your routine. You talked about some health challenges. I think a lot of people in this space get burned out, and in both of these spaces, conservation and DEI work. How do you make sure you are okay, August? How do you stay healthy?
I will first start off by saying this is something that is an area of opportunity for me.
I hear you there.
I am very confident in my skill set in a lot of areas. But I will say I am probably the poster child of what not to do. And I'm working towards modeling in my own life what I know to be. And I don't think I'm alone in this in terms of, especially being a woman, because I see a lot of my girlfriends who are mothers, who are caregivers of family members. They're the first ones to tell others, right? Their other friends, like, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to carry it all. Meanwhile, right? Yes. They're carrying it all and being perfect, right? And you can see there's kind of this unspoken thing of looking, no, everybody else, you can rest, right? Not me, of course, but you can. there's kind of this socialized martyrdom that,
Yeah.
women are, almost expected to, that your value in society is essentially how much like abuse you can manage, whether it's abuse to yourself, taking on the burdens of everyone around you. Um, and I remember a dear friend of mine, who was Dr. Black, who works in the mindfulness space as it relates to racial inequities. And she said, August, you didn't leave, working for other people and leave oppressive systems just to oppress yourself.
Oh my gosh, that's so wise and good.
Because she's like, you control your schedule. You realize that, right? Like when I was telling her, like, I didn't have time for lunch. I ate like, some Skittles that I found that my niece left in my couch, for you control your schedule. You can say no to some things. And, it's one of those things where like, we know this logically, but in practice, right? You're like, that seems so simple when you say it. But
Right.
so in terms of your question about self-care, I truly believe that rest is rebellion. I've come to really embody that and know that I do no one any favors if I am burnt out.
Right.
And so for me, a huge part of self-care is making sure that I laugh, like I belly laugh at least once a day, which means I will, like my friends think that the only type of, media I consume when it's not, about, I'm not reading toxic communities or white, spaces, black faces, is comedy. And that's, in a way, it's kind of true because, for almost 8 hours a day, right, I am talking about, having conversations, researching the sources of these inequities. And so it's important to me that I balance that out with joy. Like people oftentimes talk about like the struggle of being and the weight of being a Black woman, but there is joy also in being a Black woman. There is joy in our humanity and our dignity. And so I don't want to lose that. And so I will also say that sometimes when we are driving ourselves into the mud, sometimes the universe, our bodies, if we don't, it will whisper to us at first, right? And if we don't listen, it yells. And I'll tell you, my health yelled at me. And it yelled at me, 2 years ago. And it was like, okay, we tried to give you these little hints that you need to slow down. You need to create space for yourself. You need to sleep more and, don't just up the caffeine intake. And because I wasn't listening, my body slowed itself down for me. And I often, say that for me, my brain is my moneymaker. Like it is. And if I lose that, right, my health, right, that is what if that's gone, I'm really of no use to anybody. And in fact, I probably become a burden at that, right? And so I have slowly been implementing self-care and rest and still working at not being apologetic about that, right? It's hard because we live in a society where, we're often, taught that our value is in direct correlation to our output in terms of work. And that's a hard lesson to unlearn. And it's one of those things that you kind of have to, much like, being racially literate and being a just, person and working to interrupt some of the harmful messaging that we've been inundated with. It takes choosing that every day. It's not like I made the choice, all done, and I'm going to go skip off into the sunset. Like it's hard. You got to wake up every day and check in with yourself. So that's what I do. I remind myself every time I feel guilty for, going to hot yoga instead of responding to emails or saying no to a meeting after 5 p.m., right? Or not going and picking up my nieces because a client has an emergency, right? Which we often find, like, I get it. It feels like an emergency to you. This is not an emergency. I promise you, racism isn't going anywhere tomorrow. Every time I do that, like, I remind myself that rest is rebellion. Yeah. And boundaries are what allow us to create even more value in the world. Because if we're trying to serve everyone and do all the things, we are really doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are wise, wise, wise words. I'm not surprised that we're finishing up on a really wise and gentle and rebellious note with you, August Ball. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope you have a great yoga class.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, take care.